The perfect order. Julian Lombardi had everything under control. His life was a masterpiece of precision, each gear turning in perfect synchronization with the next. The Lombardy Empire stood as a testament to his unwavering discipline, a business colossus built through calculated decisions and meticulous planning. Nothing in Julian's world happened by accident. Nothing was left to chance. His sprawling estate reflected this same philosophy: immaculate gardens with not a leaf out of place, staff who moved through their duties like clockwork, and schedules maintained with military precision. Even the marble floors seemed to shine with a controlled gleam, as if they too understood the importance of order in the Lombardy household. On this particular afternoon, Julian moved through the grand corridors of his mansion with purposeful strides. The autumn sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished surfaces. He had just concluded a particularly successful business call. Another acquisition, another victory in the endless game of corporate chess. It was then, as he passed by the wide glass doors overlooking the eastern garden, that something caught his eye, something that didn't belong in his perfectly calibrated world. His son, Leonardo. The 12-year-old boy wasn't reading in the library as his schedule dictated. He wasn't practicing piano or working with his mathematics tutor. Instead, Leonardo was dancing. Julian froze, his reflection in the glass momentarily superimposed over the scene outside. Leonardo wasn't alone. With him was Isabella, the house cook, a woman Julian had barely acknowledged since her hiring 6 months ago. The sight was so unexpected, so utterly out of place in Julian's ordered universe, that for a moment he wondered if his eyes were deceiving him. But there they were, moving across the manicured lawn in a sequence of steps that looked rehearsed yet spontaneous. Leonardo's movements were hesitant and occasionally awkward, but what struck Julian most was his son's expression. The boy was smiling, not the polite, measured smile he offered at dinner parties or when meeting his father's business associates, but a genuine expression of joy that transformed his usually solemn face. Leonardo stumbled, missing a step, but rather than showing frustration, he laughed. The sound carried through the glass, a clear, carefree laugh that Julian realized with a sudden pang he hadn't heard in years. Not since Mariella's passing. After his mother's death 3 years ago, Leonardo had become a shadow of himself, quiet, withdrawn, moving through the world as if afraid to disturb it. Julian had attributed this to grief, to adjustment. He had hired the best child psychologists, ensured Leonardo had structure and stability. What more could be done? In time, Julian believed, the boy would emerge stronger, more disciplined, more like him. Yet here was Leonardo, laughing because of a kitchen employee. Isabella moved with a grace that seemed at odds with her position. Each step, each motion was precise and deliberate, not the playful improvisation of an amateur, but the calculated movements of someone formally trained. She wasn't merely humoring a child, she was teaching him. A cold unease spread through Julian's chest, rising like frost. He didn't like this, didn't like that someone else, especially an employee, held such influence over his son. The longer he watched, the more his irritation crystallized into something sharp and tangible. With jaw set and shoulders rigid, Julian pushed open the glass doors and stepped outside. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of the nearby rose garden. His footsteps cracked sharply against the stone pathway, announcing his approach like a warning. Leonardo noticed him first. The boy's body stiffened, his earlier joy vanishing like morning mist under harsh sunlight. Isabella turned more slowly, wiping her hands on her apron before straightening to face him. Unlike his son, she showed no apprehension, her gaze steady as she met his. "What is going on here?" Julian's voice was cool, controlled, each word precisely measured. Leonardo lowered his head, but Isabella didn't waver. "We were practicing, Señor," she said simply. "Practicing what, exactly?" Julian directed his question at his son, but it was Isabella who held his gaze. "Your son wanted to learn how to dance." Julian turned to Leonardo, his expression tightening. "Since when?" The boy hesitated, shuffling his feet on the grass. "For a while now," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. Something twisted in Julian's chest, not just irritation now, but something sharper. Guilt. He had never noticed. He had never asked. And why didn't you tell me? Leonardo lifted his shoulders in a small shrug, eyes still fixed on the ground. But before he could answer, Isabella spoke. Because he had no one to practice with. Julian narrowed his eyes at her. There was something in her tone, something firm and unwavering that both surprised and irritated him. Most employees would have been apologetic, perhaps even fearful. Isabella was neither. This isn't your job, he stated, the words clipped. No, it isn't, Isabella agreed without hesitation. Then why are you doing it? She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. Because he asked me to. Julian turned back to his son. Is that true? Leonardo nodded, finally looking up. Something passed between father and son in that moment. A silent acknowledgement of distance, of conversations never had. Julian exhaled slowly, irritation still clawing at the edges of his composure. He had no logical reason to be this bothered. Yet he was. Something about this entire situation felt off, like there was a layer to it he couldn't see. And that was unacceptable. His gaze shifted back to Isabella. I need to speak with you. Alone. Leonardo looked between them, concern creasing his young brow. Isabella, however, remained calm. As you wish, senor. Julian turned sharply and headed back toward the house without waiting for her to follow. Yet as he stepped inside, he cast a glance over his shoulder. Leonardo had leaned toward Isabella, whispering something. She responded quietly, her expression impossible to read from this distance. And the boy let out a small, conspiratorial smile. A chill ran down Julian's spine. There was something more to this. Something he wasn't seeing. And Julian Lombardi did not like mysteries in his home. Part 2. Behind the facade. Julian sat in his office, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared at his computer screen. The information before him was both ordinary and unsettling. Isabella Ruiz, 29 years old. Hired as a cook 6 months ago. No criminal record. No troubling history. Nothing that stood out in her background check or references. She was, by all appearances, exactly what she seemed to be. A house employee who did her job well and stayed out of trouble. And yet Julian couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Something hidden beneath the surface. His instincts had never failed him before. In business, he had built an empire on knowing when something wasn't as it appeared. And now those same instincts screamed that Isabella was not just a cook. He typed her name into a broader search, adding a keyword that had been nagging at the back of his mind ever since he saw her dance. Isabella Ruiz plus ballerina. At first, nothing came up. Then, buried beneath pages of irrelevant results, he found it, a news article from 7 years ago. Julian leaned forward, eyes scanning the headline, Young ballet prodigy disappears from stage without explanation. His pulse quickened as he clicked the link. As the page loaded, a photo of a much younger Isabella appeared on the screen. She was dressed in a pristine white ballet costume, standing on a grand stage, arms lifted in perfect form. Her expression was serene, confident, nothing like the reserved cook who worked in his kitchen. The article spoke of a rising star in the ballet world, a dancer with an unmatched gift. She had performed on prestigious stages across Europe and America, had been on the brink of an international career, whispered to be the next great name in classical ballet. Then suddenly, without scandal or public incident, she vanished from the spotlight. No interviews, no explanations. She simply disappeared from the world she had been poised to conquer. Julian sat back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Why would someone with that kind of talent abandon their future? And how did she end up here, cooking in his house? The questions piled up, and he knew he wouldn't get answers just by staring at a screen. He needed to hear the truth from her. Standing abruptly, Julian strode out of his office and made his way to the kitchen. The scent of garlic and herbs greeted him as he entered. Dinner preparations were underway. Isabella was there as expected, methodically cleaning countertops with the same precision he'd seen in her dance movements. She glanced up as he entered, her expression neutral but guarded. "Senor Lombardi," she greeted, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Is there something you need?" Julian didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the counter, the article about her displayed on the screen. "Care to explain this?" For the first time since he had met her, Julian saw genuine surprise flicker across Isabella's face. It was brief, but it was there, a momentary crack in her composed facade. She didn't immediately respond, instead looking at the screen, then back at him. "You've been searching for information about me," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something careful, measured. Julian folded his arms. "I don't like mysteries in my home." Isabella exhaled slowly and placed the dish towel down. For a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "I suppose I should have expected this," she said quietly. "You're not the type of man to let things go unanswered." Julian didn't respond. He only waited. She looked at the article again, her fingers brushing against the edge of the counter. "I was a dancer," she admitted. "A long time ago." "You were more than just a dancer," Julian corrected, his tone factual rather than accusatory. "You were a star." A bitter smile touched her lips. A star that burned out before it could truly shine. Julian studied her carefully. "Why did you leave?" She hesitated, and he could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she weighed whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she sighed. "Because I lost everything." Her voice was quieter now, more vulnerable than he had ever heard it. Julian didn't push, just waited for her to continue. "When I was 22, dance was my entire world," she said, her gaze distant. "It was all I knew, all I cared about. I trained endlessly, pushing myself beyond limits because I believed I was meant for something greater." She paused, then added, "And I wasn't alone." Julian frowned. "Who?" "My fiancé," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Adrian. He was a dancer too. We had trained together since we were children. We were supposed to take on the world together. We were offered an international tour, a dream we had worked toward our entire lives." Something in her tone made Julian's stomach tighten. He already knew where this was going. "The day before our biggest performance, Adrian was hit by a car," she continued, her eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. "He died instantly." Julian remained silent, the weight of her words settling between them, heavy and undeniable. "After that, I couldn't dance," she said softly. "I couldn't even hear music without feeling like a part of me had been ripped away. Everything I had built my life around was gone. And so, I disappeared." Julian let her words sink in. He had expected something tragic, but not this. Not a grief so raw it had driven her to abandon her entire identity. "So you became a cook," he said, not unkindly. Isabella let out a breath of amusement, though there was no real humor in it. "I needed something far removed from dance. Something practical. Something safe." Julian exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "And now?" She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Now I teach your son." The words hit him harder than he expected. He knew she didn't mean it as a challenge, but it felt like one. She had walked away from dance, but for some reason, she had chosen to share it with Leonardo. Why? What made her decide to break her own rule for his son? "You could have kept ignoring it," Julian said slowly. "Why help him?" She hesitated but then said simply, "Because he reminds me of myself at his age." Julian stiffened. "How?" Isabella's expression softened, just slightly. "Because he doesn't smile, Senor Lombardi." The words hit like a fist to the chest. Julian clenched his jaw, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. His son had been fading ever since his mother died, retreating into himself, into books and routines. Julian had thought that giving Leonardo stability and security was enough, the structure to rebuild his life around. But Isabella had seen something he had missed. "He smiles when he dances," she added quietly. "And I think he just needed someone to listen." Julian swallowed hard, turning away slightly. He had spent years ensuring his son had everything he needed: the best education, opportunities, resources. Everything except, perhaps, the one thing that mattered most. After a moment, he exhaled. "And what are you planning to do?" Isabella tilted her head. "You mean, will I force him to dance like it's some kind of solution to everything?" She shook her head. "No. I just want him to feel something again. The rest is up to him." Julian sat with that for a long moment, absorbing everything. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing everything that happened in his house. And yet somehow, he had been blind to the most important thing of all: his own son's happiness. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "I don't like people interfering in my family." Isabella didn't flinch. "And I don't like seeing children who have forgotten how to be children." A thick silence stretched between them. Julian had no response because, in the depths of his mind, he knew she was right. Part 3. The Challenge. 3 weeks later, the grand dining room of the Lombardi estate was unusually tense. The chandeliers above cast a warm glow over the long mahogany table, but the atmosphere was charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lighting. Leonardo stood before his father, hands clenched into small fists at his sides. At 12 years old, he was still small for his age, his frame slight beneath his school uniform. Yet there was something in his posture tonight, a determination that hadn't been there before. Julian Lombardi sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he watched his son shift nervously from foot to foot. The remains of dinner lay between them, a meal that had passed in near silence, as most meals did in the Lombardi household. Finally, Leonardo took a deep breath and spoke. "I want to compete in a dance tournament." The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian placed his silverware down with deliberate slowness, the soft clink against fine china the only sound in the vast room. His sharp gaze locked onto his son's face. "A dance tournament," he repeated, as if testing the words. Leonardo nodded, standing firm. "Yes, I want to compete." Julian exhaled, leaning back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in a steeple. "And when did you decide this?" Leonardo hesitated only a second. "A while ago. I've been training with Isabella, and she thinks I'm ready." Julian's eyes flickered with something unreadable at the mention of Isabella. "Does she?" His tone was neutral, but Leonardo didn't waver. "Yes, and I believe I am too." Julian looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw something that hadn't been there before. A fire, a determination that went beyond mere childish excitement. But it didn't erase the concerns twisting in his chest. "You realize this isn't a game, Leonardo," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Competitions aren't about fun. They're about discipline, pressure, and expectations. People will judge you. They will criticize. They will compare." Leonardo straightened his back. "I know, and I'm ready for that." Julian stared at him for a long moment, then finally exhaled. "Fine. But if you're going to do this, you do it properly. No half measures. You commit to it fully." Leonardo's face lit up with a grin, one so wide and genuine that it stunned Julian momentarily. "Thank you, Dad." Later that evening, Julian found Isabella in the kitchen, carefully chopping vegetables with the precision of someone used to structure and discipline. She glanced up as he entered, already sensing why he was there. "You knew he would ask me," Julian said, folding his arms. Isabella wiped her hands on a towel before turning to face him fully.